and welcome to today's episode of Rich, Simple, Human. If you're watching on video, you can see that you've got two glorious women in front of you, and we are about to have a very exciting conversation about women in the wealth space and how we support next gen legacy. If you are in that space, listen up. If you work in that space, stay listening. And if you're working in wealth management, certainly stay listening, because we're going to share some nuggets of information that may not have come into your sphere of influence just yet. I am sitting down with the quite incredible Ruschelle Khanna, and I cannot tell you how excited I've been about having this conversation. We have prepped some questions. We have dived, jumped around and had a conversation about all sorts of space. But what we're going to do today is unpack the work that Ruschelle is currently doing, the incredible book that she's writing with 23 contributors, no less, coming to a bookshop near you very, very soon. And we're going to talk about the challenges of the great wealth transfer. Ruschelle, welcome to today's show. Thank you for being here.
Very excited, Lindsey.
You're also jolly
Thank you so
brave
much.
because you've let me write the questions and you've allowed me to go pretty broad and pretty wide. So let's see where we go from here. Ruschelle, the first question I want to ask you about, because we're talking about women in wealth, is the great wealth transfer. This isn't an abstract concept. There are trillions of dollars about to change hands, and this is happening in families right now, and it's affecting women, more women than ever before in the history of time. I want to know what you do and how your work is supporting in this space.
Yes, Lindsey. So I think the first thing that I'm doing is screaming from the rooftops what I've uncovered or what I discovered in better understanding the great wealth transfer. And that is that it is a shifting into a deep respect for matriarchal leadership. And I think that has not been stated enough. When we think about the great wealth transfer and the history of where even the term the great wealth transfer came from, that came out of philanthropy and the philanthropy of Bill Gates. And, that was the first discussions around where is this money going as it's being transferred to generations. And although there were many, many women who have pioneered philanthropy and stewardship over the past, 200 years, well, thousands of years, really, but we're not going to go back that far. It wasn't really highlighted in what the great wealth transfer was. And the big thing that wasn't highlighted was that women are going to be the primary holders of the wealth because of this. And that is a huge opportunity for a better understanding of the way females lead, for some major systemic change that I think we can all agree desperately is needed right now.
Absolutely. It couldn't be more timely. This is happening in real time. And although there are professionals out there like the two of us who are working in this space, there aren't enough. And in fact, what I see in my work, and I think you see in yours, is women are simply not aware of the responsibility and the weight of what is coming. And to me, that seems like we do need to shout it from the rooftops. Get ready, get ready, get ready. Can I ask you, Ruschelle, in your work with women, this emotional inheritance that comes alongside the financial one, what is the biggest challenge here for people who are receiving this wealth transfer?
Well, if we're thinking about women specifically, and this was one of the primary reasons why I wrote the book, we have, like I mentioned earlier, we have actually two problems. We have systemic problems because our systems, our financial systems specifically, do not cater to the way women make financial decisions. So we have a systemic problem and we also have a narrative problem. And what the book addresses is both of those, but primarily a narrative problem. So what we've done in the book is we've gone back and we've used these wonderful Greek stories that we all love and cherish and respect, both men and women. But we've actually looked at the women in those stories and critiqued a little bit how those stories were written. They were all written by men, and the Greeks were not really is an understatement. They were not at all respectful of women. They actually thought of them as deformed males. So if that's the people who are writing this narrative that we unconsciously live by, we live by these stories that are passed down to us. And that's just one type of inheritance. We behave a certain way when those are our our narratives. We've got this collective narrative, and then we have our family narrative. We have our genetic narrative, right? So we're born into these bodies with a ton of stuff that wasn't our choosing, yet we're making decisions off of all of that that was passed down to us.
And what's the impact of that as this enormous amount of wealth, I'm going to use the word lands in women's laps, that's not the right terminology. What is the impact there?
The impact of that is that we don't always know who we are. And the point of my work is to help people get very clear about defining who they are. So identity sits at the everything that we do. How we make financial decisions is an identity question. Am I comfortable buying a $1,000 handbag and I'm not comfortable making a $1,000 investment decision with my financial advisor? That's an identity problem. And so what we do is in both of my roles. So I work with families, I consult families, and I'm also the co-founder of the Ancestral Healing Center. So we do deep personal work in that space. And in both of those spaces, we look at peeling back the layers of what the world has told you you are, what your family has told you you are. And we help people decide for themselves, no, this is who I am. And this is actually where my values align and what I'd like to do with my time and my money.
That's such a powerful statement because, of course, financial decision making isn't based on numbers. We know it's based on emotions. We know that there's a relational and a spiritual aspect to money as well. And we are kidding ourselves to think that successful investors are just using data. That would suggest that AI will take over our financial systems totally. And of course, it doesn't work that way at all. Ruschelle, can you tell me a bit more about the book? Because I now know there are people thinking, well, who are these 23 contributors? And what does it look like? And also, where can I get a copy? So let's cover that off early on in this conversation.
Happily. So I do need to go back a little bit and explain a little bit of who I am before I get to the book. So I have been doing work with families as a therapist and an advisor for over 20 some years. But I worked in the New York metropolitan area pretty much in a silo. I didn't have a network of advisors that I worked with. I had a few close clinicians and physicians that I worked with to serve the families that I work with. And during COVID, I left the city and came back to my home state of West Virginia, which is very rural. I kept my clients, but I thought, oh, I need a network. So I went on LinkedIn and I discovered the ultra high net worth advisory world that I'd been in, but didn't know I was in for all of these years. And I came upon a problem. And the problem was, who is legitimate? There are so many advisors out there. How do I decide who is legitimate? So I started interviewing people, and really, I spent a lot of time really getting to know a lot of the advisors. And I thought, you know what? If it's this hard for me to find a competent advisor, then it must be this hard for the families as well. And how do they discern that? So in my search to find a high caliber group of people that I could rely on and refer to and ask questions of, I thought, well, their voices need to be heard. And I thought, well, why don't we just write a book together? And actually, the original idea was that I was going to start an trauma-informed advisory website where people could come and find trauma-informed advisors. And that may still happen at some point, but I think the book was more important. These are women and men. There are two men in the book. These are women and men who've worked in the high net worth space for many years. Offices have a kick-butt divorce attorney who helps women navigate narcissistic divorces. Melissa Gregg is her name. She's from St. Louis. Stacy Feiner is an incredible powerhouse of a woman, and she wrote a book in collaboration called The Sixth Level. Leaned a lot from in terms of writing this book because it highlights female psychology. And that female psychology is quite different than male psychology. In fact, what they propose is that Maslow's hierarchy, if we're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Maslow stops at self-actualization. And he says that primarily men, right? Because that's the framework we're working in. Men are happy self-actualizing. Women are not. Women are happy in the collective, and they go above self-actualization and make decisions always with the collective in mind. And we are wired that way. If women can see, if we take Maslow's hierarchy as law, then that means that we're women who make decisions based on the collective are deficient in some way or abnormal. And the book is really about breaking down those stereotypes. That's not abnormal. That's a different way of being. That's the feminine way of being.
I love the way that you've described that, because Maslow's hierarchy of needs is still being referenced. In fact, I use it in my own work with coaching clients, of course. But if we think back to those tribal days, men are out hunting and women are in the caves looking after the community. You have to have an eye on everybody else. We're wired that way. And it is so, so important. I'm so delighted to hear that that is part of the book. Can you tell me a bit more about what people will expect when they get a copy of this incredible book? Because I now know people are desperate to read it, because you're so right, Ruschelle. Women in this space are being overwhelmed with advisors. And I see it myself because of the work that I do, both between Switzerland and London, that the number of advisors, even with teenagers, 18 to 25, young adults, is absolutely vast. And the discernment required to make sure that that's in your best interest is absolutely incredible. And I'm afraid is also not there. So please tell us a bit more about what's going to be in the book and how people can benefit.
Sure. So if history lovers are listening, they're going to love it, because they're going to get a quick jaunt through Greek myth, and they're also going to get a critique of that myth, that we don't, when we think of texts that we revere, we don't have to agree with them or take them as gospel always. We can pick out what we want. I think in AA, chew the meat and spit out the bones.
Always.
Right. So that's discernment, right? That is discernment. So you'll get a quick jaunt through Greek history, and then you'll get to hear the voices of these incredible women and the work that they've done and the advice that they would bestow upon. We have two different types of readers, and the introduction talks about that. Some are women who maybe are struggling to find their place and their footing in making financial decisions. And then we have other women that are like powerhouses and they're running things, yet there might still be elements of their life where they're not don't fully feel like they've embodied a good, a sense of what they would really like to be doing. So for example, maybe you're great in the philanthropy space and you'll love the philanthropy essay, but when it comes to work-life balance, which was written by Emily Bouchard. Emily works with family offices. She's a chief learning officer and governance advisor. And she writes about work-life balance and what we need there. And the Greek goddesses are referenced. So it's a beautiful read. I collaborated with Anne Priftit. She is the founder of Off Piste. She's an art dealer. She has art houses and works with family offices in the art space. And I think that's a unique slant that women bring that is overlooked and considered maybe not as important, is this idea of embodying beauty and making things elegant and beautiful. When really, if we made decisions from what is the most beautiful choice that I could make here, that's a very different decision than what is the most cost efficient. Yeah, the outcomes are drastically different.
And of course, as we're recording this, we're in very turbulent times. That speaks to exactly some of the political conversations that are happening at the moment. The most beautiful and elegant outcome is completely different from what is the most cost effective in so many cases. And when I speak to women, they have a yearning for exactly what you've just described, the most community orientated, kind, beautiful and effective outcome. But they're being driven very often by a bottom line, even in this ultra high net worth space. And I said to somebody only today, you do know that you don't need the money. That's a very harsh statement to make, but we lose sight of why we're in this space sometimes. And of course, with the responsibility of stewardship of this great amount of wealth, why are we in this space? What do we do with it? It's a really, really beautiful way to put it, Ruschelle. And I love the way you've said that. I think there is a bit of permission, isn't there? And I'm very fortunate at the moment to be in a series of events where I'm actually facilitating female investors, encouraging new investment. Women are spending, but they're certainly not investing. And I think the statistics in the UK are 80% of ultra high net worth women in the UK have a pension but not an investment portfolio. What's happening there? So they're not investing the money. It's just a passive pension pot. And I think there's a permission in there that I think your book gives to people. Would that be right?
One of the writers, Dominique Karatsos, she is Greek. She is also a sex therapist and a venture capitalist and a philanthropist and just a very dynamic person. She writes about our sexual values and our financial values and how they can't be separated. And we could do a whole other podcast on the overlap between sex and money. So that we can do another day. But that, I think, this idea of permission if we talk about permission, we're also talking about consent, right? And I'm allowed is a very, very powerful statement. I'm allowed to have pleasure. I'm allowed to make decisions about my body. I'm allowed to learn how to be financially literate. I'm allowed to take command of a room that is overseeing my money. Why am I allowing men or anybody else or another woman for that matter to make decisions about my money? And why is this passive? Do you hear how that can be sexual values as well? Everything that I just said can be sexual values as well, right? So I think for women, money decisions, not just for women, for everybody, but I think particularly women, money decisions are very intimate decisions. And if we don't know what we're doing or we don't feel like we know what we're doing, we can freeze and just not do anything at all. But think about the woman who feels confident and liberated in her sexuality, really safe, confident and liberated. I don't mean the fake liberated that maybe is on social media today. It's the same thing. The power and the pleasure that you get out of making good financial decisions it's amazing, right? And yeah, so there are women who get to experience that because they know that and they've embodied that. And then there are women who have been cut off from that and shut down.
I recently heard the words aligning heart and hand when it came to giving and emotions. And this is not an area of expertise for me, but it's something I spend a lot of time talking to people about money because of the kind of work I do. Aligning desires and passions, energy money as an energy, the spiritual worship of money. These are such interesting conversations. And Ruschelle, I think you're right. This is a whole other podcast in itself to be dealt with. But of course, this is all very much linked together. We can't separate the two.
Yeah. Absolutely. All of these things should be pleasurable. And what systemically has happened is all pleasure has been stripped away from a lot of things. I mean, if we think about even our dining experiences, I mean, I live in the US, right? And let me just go back a little bit because the way I think about our American landscape is the thought that I've brought into the book. American landscape used to be these beautiful small towns that had artisans and business owners and people who were invested in their communities. And now the American landscape is an industrialized, cold interstate. And that's a masculinity problem. That is over masculine energy in a space. And the minute that the feminine comes back into that, suddenly we're in these beautiful communities again. And I'm not at all, the book does not pit masculine against feminine at all. I love my husband. I love masculinity, I revere it. It's a wonderful thing, but they need to be in harmony. And actually they come into harmony when we know who we are and we act through our values.
I love that. I think people will be so hungry to learn so much more about this, and we'll try and make some links for the show notes, Ruschelle, because I think they'll be much more pointed towards your work and how they can experience this pleasure that should be part of our life experience as humans here on Earth. And of course, we miss it. We won't now jump into addiction, Manjaro, and all the other things, because food and pleasure and, oh my gosh, all the things. I live in a rural part of Europe a lot of the time, and there is real pleasure in some of these things still that there is there isn't left in some places. But yes, what a shame that we've got to this place. I want to ask you about women as architects of generational wealth, because as you've just said, research consistently shows that when women lead in the wealth space, outcomes improve across families, communities, and generations. You've touched on why some of that is, but I want to know really what your answer to that question is in terms of why are women not being architects of generational wealth historically?
So I'll go back to the two things that the book addresses. Systemically, when I say systemically, the word patriarchy is a bit prickly for some people, but there has been an overabundance of male domination. That is not to say that women have not done amazing things in our history for stewarding wealth. Completely the opposite. I mean, there's a laundry list of amazing women from history who have done amazing things for the community. Actually, just wrote a piece about the Cheekwood family. Cheekwood, I believe they were coffee. I believe it was coffee. Anyway, they created the Folgers, maybe Folgers or Maxwell House, one of the big coffee brands. Amassed tremendous wealth in Nashville. The father who had amassed the wealth built this beautiful home based around one mirror, and it was just this huge monster of a home, and he died. And then the wife and then the daughter created this incredible legacy that now the city of Nashville gets to have. Cheekwood is a beautiful, lavish park that the whole city uses, and it's a beautiful place where there's festivals at Christmas. So Cheekwood they could have just kept it in the family, or they could have just sold it off and built condos there. But the heir decided, no, this is a place for the community, and I want our family to be known for giving something to the community. So I hope that does that
it
answer
absolutely
your question?
does. And it amazes me when we talk about legacy. What do you want to leave behind in this ultra high net worth space? That people aren't as dialed in as I expect them to be in terms of vision. And we know that as humans, we find it quite difficult to do this sort of future discounting, to be able to visualize what we might be working towards. We end up in the sort of the day to day, and then we panic about the future, but we're not terribly effective at setting that vision, understanding, okay, what's the purpose? How do we steward this? Where are we going? And when I'm no longer here on earth, how have I left it? And we spend so much time in financial planning, tax structures, looking at all of the nuts and bolts. But like you've just described, that vision of what am I leaving here as a legacy is so powerful, but it requires a feminine creativity. And when we cut that off, I think that's when we lose that vision. So absolutely. I love the way that you've just described that. And I think if you go out there and start looking at women in philanthropy, the numbers are not great. And we know that we have issues with female founders and funding for female founders because the money isn't always coming from female investors, part of the space I work in. We know that women aren't terribly active in this space for some reason. And it's not a financial problem. And it's not a confidence problem. But like you say, it's systemic. And the narrative has been unhelpful. Can I ask you, Ruschelle, about the next generation? Because as I'm a mother of daughters, and I'm also very fortunate to work in some aspects of education, see women not taking the lead in families in terms of informing their daughters about how they can then be part of the family vision, the stewardship. I just don't see women taking a very active role there. What's going wrong? And what do you think families who do conduct really, really solid and financially sound wealth transfer, what do they do differently from families that aren't as successful?
So whether or not you are trying to do a succession plan with adult children or you have newborns, the answer is the same. It is parenting. So you will either have to reparent. If you want a good succession plan, and this is the work that I do a lot of what I call pre-governance work. So if you want the good financial structures and the good legal structures to work, and I've seen this a million times, people spend all the money on the governance structures. But if you don't have pre-governance, which is a strong family team, and if you think about a team, everybody on the team knows what their role is. They have their individual goal and they have the collective goal. That's a good team. So if we don't have that, it doesn't matter what the governance structures are, they will fail. And women are good, very, very good at making sure the pre-governance stuff is taken care of. I don't think I've worked with a family who didn't say, who was the leader of your family? Well, the answer to that question, on the surface, it was the male. But who was holding the family together was always the grandma. Grandpa was not holding the family together. Grandpa was doing wonderful things, and he was out there bringing in resources and making connections. But grandma was weaving the stories and making sure the house was wonderful, and also making good connections and supporting grandpa. And, so what's going wrong is we don't know our role. We don't know who we are. We're allowing the outside world to tell us who we are constantly. And I work on this personally. I work on so much. I try to come back to myself. And even when you work on it a lot, you wake up some days and you're like, how did I do that? Why did I make that decision? It's a boundary issue. As you know, in your work, boundaries in families are so incredibly important. They're the foundation. Well, the boundary starts with, I know who I am.
Yeah, I think you've described that so well, Ruschelle, and I love that language that you use, pre-governance, because I hear that conversation all the time, especially at board level conversations, governance. But that pre-governance and the piece you've just talked about, the vision and values, the relationships and the roles, and the communication and the identity. If you haven't done that piece, any amount of governance, financial structures will fail. So if you're listening to this, just let that drop in. You do need to do the pre-governance work. And in the marketplace, Ruschelle, I don't see that being done on a regular basis. Do you?
So what I found when I came into the advisory world was a lot of people the families that I work with, they're like, do we have to do another values exercise? Please don't make me do another values exercise. But the depth of the actual exercise that the families are getting, the depth is not there to actually sit down with somebody and ask them who they are, is a different question than what's our family mission statement, right? There's a surface level values work that I think is done in the governance space that some families are ready for. There is a place for that. But a lot of families are not ready for that. They really need to do some self-exploration and some collective family exploration. And that's where some of the work with inherited patterns and ancestral healing, people have different associations to these terms. So the intergenerational stuff is super important.
Let's talk about that next, because as you know, this is the terminology here is very strange. It's also very different depending on where you are in Europe, in the US, in the UK. The words trauma, intergenerational trauma, inherited characteristics. I've just gone live with a podcast on just that. Do we inherit defects of character? This is a very nuanced conversation, and your area of expertise, in fact, your role as the founder of the Ancestral Healing Center, is as an expert. Can you tell us what you mean by some of those terms and just explain why it's important to people in the wealth transfer space?
Yeah, so as I said before, good governance is good parenting, and it's either reparenting adults or it's doing the work up front as your kids grow. So if that's the case, then what makes good parenting, Lindsey? Good parenting is made from understanding our own pain points, our own limitations, and working to be better people every day and being able to show up for our family in a way that creates these really solid attachments. So these bonds and attachments are what make your governance structures work. If you're talking about family businesses or the ideal of a family office, and we can talk about the ideal of a family office later because most family offices are not operating under the ideal. But anyway, we're talking about good attachments. So if we want to understand good attachments, we have to understand childhood experiences. And a lot of our childhood experiences are not pleasant. Some of them are, Some people have wonderful, idyllic childhoods, and that's wonderful. I'm not here to say that everybody has trauma, because some people grew up in really nice homes where they were loved and adored. That doesn't mean that what we inherit from grandma and grandpa might not be difficult. And we know it is a fact. We inherit, actually, there is research now showing that we inherit full memories. And my first book, Inherited Trauma and Family Wealth, was written because I inherited a memory from my mother. And that memory shaped my entire career decisions. And I see that a lot. I often see inherited trauma impact financial and career decisions. Maybe it's because it happened to me and that's what I was attracted to, but it's not some sort of metaphysical woo science that we inherit very specific things from our ancestors. So let's say mom and dad were great to me. I didn't grow up in an abused home, but grandpa survived the Holocaust and then moved to the US and built a multi-million-dollar business, but he still made us eat leftovers from 3 days ago because of a fear of starving. Okay, that's not abuse, but it's a pattern of thinking about resources. And these little details about how we think about resources are what's valuable to family businesses and family offices.
This is so nuanced, and it's such an interesting conversation, Ruschelle. I think we should unpack definitely in another show. Of course, we know that this is handed down. There's such a lot of evidence now that we inherit memories. We've seen it evidenced in some of the studies in animal behavior, actually, where there's been no connection of the baby mice and the cherry blossoms. They weren't even born. They inherited this trauma of the electric shocks that they were given. The parents were given as a test. Work, we know that it is in the DNA, it is encoded, it is transmitted, it is handed down, and we see it a lot in some of the adoption studies. Behavior that comes out that is behavior that is inherited. It's not learnt, because the children didn't grow up in that environment at all. They grew up somewhere very different. And these are really important things to talk about, because it impacts an enormous amount of the way we think, feel, act, and ultimately behave. This is fascinating work that you do, and I think we should definitely reference the book, Inherited Trauma and Family Wealth. If you haven't read it, please get a copy of Ruschelle's book previously, because that's also very, very helpful in this space. Can I just ask you about chain breakers? Because that was something that's really crucial. I know that I can talk about this because I am one. I think that you've done enough work on yourself to know that you've done it as well. Nobody's perfect. So when we think about perfect parenting, or if we are parents, there is no perfect parent, because we are all imperfect. And when we do parent, we do our best, which means any child can look back and say, I loved what mum and dad did here, but I didn't love this bit, and I won't continue to do that. And that's very, very powerful. So we don't have to be labeling, the adverse childhood experiences or the trauma, but this is a natural conversation that I don't see being had enough. What would you say to chain breakers and that sort of mindset, Ruschelle, of very clever and advanced self-awareness?
For people who are in it and ready to do it, I think if you're not already doing it, if you want to take things to the next level, then using a genealogy and narratives, your family narratives, spend some time with someone just writing down and talking through your family stories, and see the things that you will uncover about your own patterns in your life are incredible, both good and bad. I think one of the coolest things about doing so much ancestral healing for myself and for others is it keeps expanding how appreciative I am of my ancestors and where I came from, and just how badass they were. Just incredible circumstances, and the creativity. So the more you uncover it, actually, the more strengths you find in your own family. For people who are also kind of not interested in doing this, it's a lot of fun. It's not all digging around in painful stuff and having to go back to painful things. You really start to uncover some really wonderful things. So that, and then one other thing is that I would encourage you to do travel that relates to your ancestry. If you haven't taken a trip to your homeland or where your ancestors walked, I promise if you go there, something magical will happen. So I think that's just another fun thing that I like to see
cannot
people
agree
do.
with you enough that clients of mine who are engaged and interested in where they came from and have been back to visit some of those places, even if they're quite diverse, have found it so transformational without, I'm going to say they didn't do the work. That's not the right terminology, but they went because they were energetically in the same space. They retraced those footsteps almost organically, but it, like you say, it has a transformational effect on who you are and who you were born to be. Come from a line of bulletproof women, bomb-proof women. They lived forever. That doesn't mean that they were kind, soft, and gentle, but they were bomb-proof. And the work I've done on myself, when I can hold on to that, and I've got daughters, this is a very powerful thing. It wasn't always pleasant, but it's a very, very interesting, like say, narrative to explore. So if you are working with a therapist at the moment or with a coach or somebody that's in this space, please make sure you're having those conversations or seek out somebody like Ruschelle or I to have those sorts of dialogues with, because it's so powerful. I can't tell you, this is not something that was on my radar until about 5 years ago, but what a difference it's made.
My life just the magic keeps coming since I came to this. I got very sick. I had Lyme disease. I had neurological Lyme disease, and the ancestral healing work was something that serendipitously came out of that. And since 2014, just understanding where I came from has just been this magical experience.
It's absolutely incredible. I hope that people are now hungry to read your book, hungry to do some of this work for themselves. And if you want to improve your own parenting, this has to be one of the most transformational things I've ever done. That self-awareness of myself has changed everything. It's changed who I am, how I behave, and how I relate to my own parents. Actually, it's been a very healing experience. And I think you'll agree we've had that conversation. So please, please, please think about this kind of work. In the context of family office, of course, if you are a woman in the wealth space, how transformational is this to you and the generations and generations and generations and generations to come? Ruschelle, we could talk about this for about 5 hours, but we won't today. Can I just ask you about AI? Because we're in a very strange space, particularly this year, actually, with the rapid acceleration of AI. And you have said that AI distances us from our intuition. Could you just talk to that a little bit and share what people might do about A, recognizing that's happening, and B, countering it?
Yeah, so I was actually just there is a chapter in the book about AI and attachments. So that will be something that you can explore as you get the book. But we were having a conversation with a couple of the women who write the book about this idea of decision making and where do we even go to find resources, and where do we as women go to find trusted spaces where we can safely ask questions and all this. And it led to, we're in the future, we're not even going to be doing a search. Like, you won't even have forget going to the library, forget going to Google where you have a list of 100 options to choose from. Chat is telling you who's the most female-friendly financial advisor. You need to go to Charles Schwab. Okay, I'll go to Charles Schwab. So where is our discernment going when it comes to AI, and where is our decision making? And that's why we as women need to be building systems. We have a systemic problem. We have a narrative problem. And I don't want to be shouting about problems all the time, because there's a lot of wonderful things happening in the world. But if we don't develop the systems just tell us what to do. That's all there is to it. And so our children, our daughters and our sons, I think that discernment is going to be the number one skill. I mean, outside of having a healthy body, first your body is healthy, right? But we have to learn how to discern things. And we have to know that if we're told something, that is not gospel.
Absolutely.
And that's what scares me with AI, and what I'll try to, do something about as
I
best
think that's
can.
our urge, isn't it? That if you are a woman with wealth or investing or with the potential to invest, will you please, please, please consider how you could be active in this space, especially when it comes to AI? Because if we don't have women's voices in that space, we won't be able to influence or impact it. I think we begin to think, well, is it really relevant to me? And the answer is yes, yes, yes. In terms of tuning up our discernment, of course, if you are so busy rushing around all day in your clever head and you're not connected in your mind and your body, you're also missing most of your operating system anyway. So that's a whole other conversation to be had another time. Ruschelle, before we close up today's show, there's about 150 podcasts in this, and I know that there's 23 contributors in the book, and that's going to be really helpful to people as well to learn a little bit more. If people would like to contact you and get into dialogue and conversation, where can they find you? And are there any other resources that you could point people towards today?
Sure. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn and also at ancestralhealingcenter.com. And my advisory work is at lifestyleforlegacy.com. That's where I work with families. And if you have questions about pre-governance, please contact me there. And we would love to hear from you at the Ancestral Healing Center as it's just kicking off this year. And we're super excited about where.
Well, I'm excited for another podcast on that. And until next time, Ruschelle, thank you for being such a wonderful guest. Please, please, please listen and learn from some of this. We will link all of the details below. We will also link Ruschelle's previous book and a link to where we can keep an eye on the upcoming list. I'm sure there's a list that somebody can join to get the heads up about when it's coming. But until next time, please stay as a rich and simple human. Please think about how you can impact the world with your decisions. And until we meet again, Ruschelle, thank you so much.
Good to see you.